and obviously it struck him. If this mediocre guy, ruthless thug with limited education, could be worshipped by Mongols because Mongols accepted him, why can't I do? Okay. So he reread this book, and the most strange thing which I found out, Roerich was able to personally verify the stories about if it's true or not true, whatever Asendowski mentioned in his book. Because old Roerich's brother was a white army officer who was in charge of the supply train in the army of Bloody White Baron. Okay. Vladimir Roerich was a white army officer who served in the white army in Mongolia. Later, he escaped from the Reds to Harbin, and they corresponded. Okay, so that's how he could verify all these stories. So that's this White Bloody Baron, whose book also inspired Roerich. Okay. Final straw that was tremendous success of Bolsheviks, Red Russia, in Mongolia and Western China, where Bolsheviks, Red Russians, tried to link Shambhala prophecy to communism by telling Mongols and local nomads, hey, communism is your red Shambhala. And many nomads accepted this idea. Here you can see a tanka, Buddhist tanka with Lenin's face. Do you see it? That's when Roerich said, hey, I have to overcome my hatred of Bolsheviks and to go to Moscow to establish a union with Bolsheviks. And he begins to promote this idea. We need to mix communism and Tibetan Buddhism. That would be the philosophy of the new theocracy, the sacred union of the East. So I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Again, let me keep something for you, so you will read it on your own. So the book is available there, and here I'm going to finish, and we will have plenty of time for our questions, so please ask your questions, and thank you so much.
So that was an overview, and we probably could be able to go into depth if you have very specific questions about what Andrei's brought into light. So we've got microphones on either side of the house, so which we can use those. So if anybody has questions straight away, just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. We have a question right over here on the other side of the house and also in the first row here. So yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful overview. This is a very wide subject. Very quickly, do you have any guidance on what is the esoteric practice study, a key document that Nicholas Roerich followed? Like I know they channeled Master Moria and they channeled some of the ascended masters, but is there one particular book that you might have come across in your research which sort of speaks of the esoteric practices?
There is a book. Unfortunately, I didn't mention another source, his son, George Roerich, who was a professional Tibetan scholar who went to Sorbonne to study. He knew several languages, including Tibetan. And George Roerich served as an interpreter during Roerich's first Tibetan expedition and the second expedition that was blessed by FDR in 1935. Okay. So George Roerich knew a lot about Kalachakra Tantra. Okay. And particularly, George Roerich translated this interesting book talking about a source. It's called Blue Annals. Blue Annals. It's one of the texts that belongs to Kalachakra Tantra tradition. Okay, and there is a small article. If you Google it, George Roerich, Kalachakra, it will take you. If you Google it, it will take you to PDF article. George Roerich wrote a small article about Kalachakra Tantra, and there you will read about this source, which he and his father studied.
Great, we had a question in the first row, if you don't mind.
Hi, I was wondering if the Roerichs ever had a spiritual teacher. I mean, he knew Dorji in working on the Kalachakra temple, but did he accept him as a teacher? Did he ever meet Blavatsky?
Roerich believed, he didn't have a teacher. He didn't. Roerich believed that this Master Moria, his virtual teacher, was his teacher. Darjeev, when he knew Darjeev, he was not yet a theosophist. Roerich became theosophist after 1980 and 1990. Before, he was doing some readings, but he was not part of the theosophical movement. Okay, so only when he moved to England, and it happened in 1918, that's when he plunged himself in theosophical movement. Okay, and ironically, Helena Roerich replicated spiritual experiences of Madame Blavatsky. So Madame Blavatsky met her spiritual guides in Hyde Park in London, and Helena claimed that she met her spiritual guides in Hyde Park. Helena Blavatsky moved to New York City to continue her spiritual quest. And Roerich, Helena, and Nicholas also moved to New York City. Blavatsky eventually moved to India, and Nicholas and Helena also moved to India and settled there. So there was some, but they wanted to go further to overshadow Madame Blavatsky by doing this geopolitical utopia. So they thought they would be more famous. No, answering your question, he didn't have an actual teacher.
Let's take some questions to the back. We've got two there. So, that gentleman and then, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your understanding of the motives and maybe the plans of Lenin and the early Bolsheviks in supporting Roerich and his search for the Shambhala prophecy?
Excellent question. See, Roerich found out something that some Bolsheviks, if they didn't buy his idea of mixing Tibetan Buddhism and communism, but they became interested. And what was something that attracted Bolsheviks? First of all, Roerich denounced Christianity, denounced all these staple Western religions. Okay, he wasn't interested in Judaism, of course, and a few times he spoke in a derogatory form about Christianity. But he spoke about Tibetan Buddhism, particularly Buddhism, not Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhism, as a religion of the oppressed. And that's how the Bolsheviks viewed Buddhism. Okay, Buddhism at first was not included in a list of religions that should be destroyed. Okay, it was originally Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So Buddhism, in fact, Bolsheviks sponsored in 1918 an exhibit of Tibetan art in Petrograd. Can you imagine? The city devastated by the war. You know, what could you do there? You know, you were struggling to find food, and here they are. One of the goals was to attract masses of Asians to their side. The reason why they tried to attract Asians to their side is that originally Bolsheviks expected that this revolutionary Holocaust, Armageddon, would spread to the West. But when Germans and English people did not respond to this, okay, they turned their attention to the East. Okay, why don't we work with the masses of colonial people? And it did work, because going against the grain, many Bolsheviks started to gamble on national liberation movements. Because originally, in traditional Marxism, nobody interested in nationalism. So that's how Bolsheviks tried to milk national liberation movements, and that's how they plugged themselves into these prophecies. And in my book, there's a fascinating story. It's a marvelous story how Bolsheviks sent expeditions after they took over Mongolia from this bloody white baron. Okay, because bloody white baron could not capitalize on his success, but Bolsheviks could. Okay, they used Shambhala prophecy to as much as possible by telling the Meds that communism is your red Shambhala. After they took over Mongolia, Bolsheviks immediately started to send expeditions to Tibet, trying to draw Dalai Lama to their side. And there were 4 expeditions Bolsheviks, atheists, essentially disguised as Lama pilgrims going to Lhasa, trying to talk Dalai Lama into supporting the Red Cause. Okay, so there was in my book you will find the whole chapter about it. It's a fascinating story. Okay, how these people essentially had to play a role. They didn't believe in Buddha. They didn't believe in anything. And they describe how they had to pretend that they were Tibetan monks. The plan was that junior monks in Tibet would revolt against Tibetan officialdom. So they considered Bolsheviks, the junior monks, as a new revolutionary class, analogy of proletariat. Okay, since there was no working class there, so let's appeal to these guys. Did that answer your question? Okay.
So we had another question in the back. Yes, yes, this lady here. Yeah.
About the books, if I'm not mistaken, Roerich wrote this Agni Yoga series and also the Leaves of the Moria Gardens, at least in Russian. I don't know if they are translated. So it's closely related to yoga philosophy. My question is, do you have any data or knowledge whether the Gurdjieff and Roerich met, or their pastors met, or Gurdjieff met Shambhala?
They never met each other. In fact, one of the reasons why Roerich moved to the United States, he wasn't happy about being in England, because in England, first as an artist, he had to compete with these great masters like Malevich, Kandinsky. That's the first reason. Second reason, he had to compete with a bunch of spiritual seekers, Uspensky, Gurdjieff, you name them. So he wanted to be, he and Helena believed that they were destined to do something different. They were special people. So that is why they needed like pristine land. And the United States was this pristine soil that they could plow. Okay. In fact, he stole some students from Gurdjieff. Okay. A few students of Gurdjieff joined Roerich, and one of them, Colonel Kardashevsky, whose name was mentioned in this brief clip, okay, a Baltic baron who left Gurdjieff because he was upset about Gurdjieff, this tedious physical exercises, so exhausting. And he joined Roerich, where Roerich did not require so much commitment. You needed to demonstrate the spiritual commitment. Okay.
I think we had another hand at the back, and then back to the front. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. It's fascinating. I wonder if you know the work of Modris Eckstein, historian at Toronto University, in regard to his theory that Nicholas Roerich's Rite of Spring, working with the Belarus and Nijinsky, was actually a magical ritual that created such a psychic shock that it caused World War I.
Ooh.
The book is called The Rites of Spring, and he makes quite a case for this, that art was used to destroy the old order. And I wonder if you know Modris Eckstein. Secondly, I didn't hear any mention of Rasputin, and I wonder if you know anything about his Tibetan teacher, Bala.
Are you talking about Badmaev?
I'm talking about a Tibetan guru that Rasputin had, and revealed in the movie Agonia, his name was Bala.
Huh. To be honest, I never heard about Rasputin, Tibetan teacher. I know that Nicholas II and Rasputin had Tibetan Buddhist teacher, but he was Siberian, certain Nicholas Badmaev. Okay, but about this, I'm sorry, I never heard about it, so I apologize. I probably should look into this, you know. But to my knowledge, you made reference to this movie, Agonia. It's not a documentary movie. It's a feature movie. Yeah, because from what I read, there was no Tibetan teacher. Rasputin didn't have this particular teacher named by this name, at least to my knowledge. Maybe it was a prototype for Nicholas Badmaev, as Bal. Okay, that's my assumption. Okay. The first part of your question.
Oh, the first part was dealing with the psychic impact of art, consciously used by Nicholas Roerich, Diaghilev, Nijinsky and Stravinsky
Mm-hmm.
in the event of the Rite of Spring, which is this sacrificial ritual drawn from ancient pagan
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
rites.
Mm-hmm.
And that this was
Sacrifice, yeah, human sacrifice.
sacrifice seen on stage
Mm-hmm.
was something that was used as a psychological catalyst
Mm-hmm.
to drive the audience's psyche.
Mm-hmm. See, I'm.
The reason I came to the lecture today was the reference to the use of Buddhism and occult studies by the secret police, and I was going to ask you about Berry and that kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
But we're on this topic, and it's a very significant topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend Modris Eckstein, Toronto University.
I will certainly look into this. But my understanding, see, I have to confess that I am going to, whatever you said, I'm going to turn it upside down, you know, and to tell you that whatever was reflected in the rites of spring probably was anticipation of the coming Armageddon, because the whole world at that time was pregnant with this catastrophes. They were coming everywhere, Northern Africa and Southeastern Asia. These small wars eventually escalated in this great Armageddon, the First World War, you know. It starts with the Spanish-American War. Okay, we're not going there. So anyway, I'm talking as a historian, right?
We had a question in the front. Yes,
I just wondered, how did
Here's the microphone for you.
Roerich support himself? Where did he sell his art, and that's how he was able to support these expeditions and living in India? And
Mm-hmm. Perfect question. Perfect question. Thank you so much for asking, because that's one of the first questions that I asked myself, where did the money come from? He had a big, powerful sponsor, Louis Horsch. He was a currency speculator from Chicago who sponsored all his expeditions. The guy had a disfigured face and basically, again, traumatized, and Roerich found the key to his heart, and he was essentially, Roerich, a spiritual healer for this person and his wife. And then they lost a child, okay? Horsch and his wife, they lost a child. So Roerich and Helena provided spiritual comfort, and as a gratitude, Horsch sponsored his expeditions. The first Tibetan expedition cost $95,000, okay? The building in Upper Manhattan that was built, it was built on Louis Horsch money, okay? Eventually, Horsch spent so much money to sponsor Roerich adventures that he became bankrupt. And they had a huge disagreement. Eventually, Horsch sued him. And Roerich had to escape from New York. So one of the reasons he settled in India, because he was afraid to come back to the United States. Okay? Horsch tried to argue that he had to pay taxes by using money to go to a Tibetan expedition. Roerich argued, no, it was a scientific enterprise. I don't have to pay money, it's research. So, but the court, in 1935, there was a court case against Roerich, and Louis Horsch said, yes, I gave him money, but he didn't pay taxes. And by that time, Horsch befriended, as Roerich, and Horsch and Roerich, they knew FDR. So Horsch visited FDR and asked him to call a judge. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called this particular judge, and a decision, appropriate decision was made to penalize Roerich. You know, it's in documents. Yeah, fix the case. That's what's amazing, you know. Again, as a historian, I know why and how it happened, because FDR did not trust judges. He had big fights with the Supreme Court. You know, he was more than happy to do it in this case. You know, he interfered and.
Did he ever pay the taxes?
No, he never paid the taxes, and all his art was confiscated here. Okay, it's a part of the museum in different galleries, so everywhere. Okay, so he lost his collection. Okay.
There is no Roerich painting in the Rubin Museum of Art collection. I just want to point
Nothing?
that out. No, nothing. But isn't it interesting? Like, I don't know if you were here last week, but that's exactly the same question. How did Blavatsky survive? You know, how did she make a living? And that's exactly the question we had. So anyway, who's got another question? Anybody else? Have we totally exhausted this topic? I don't think so. Well, I have a question for you, because you know, we did talk about the sort of the spy and the Soviet secret police and all that. Can you just fit that element in as a finishing piece of how that worked? I mean, you alluded to it, but can you just give a little more, a little taster of what that was, because that's such a fascinating feature.
That's a real thriller in my view, because I knew about Roerich when I started writing this book, but I never knew about this name of this person, and I'm sure you never heard about him. It's Gleb Boki, who became interested in Kalachakra Tantra and Shambhala prophecy, a Bolshevik, one of the bosses of the Soviet secret police. He was the chief cryptographer in the Soviet Union, and he sponsored research in Tibetan Buddhism. He conducted experiments in his secret lab, where they brought shamans, Tibetan lamas. The goal was to explore something which Bolsheviks might not know, the knowledge that could be used to manufacture or to engineer the new human being, because at that time, people both on the left and on the right, they were interested in manufacturing the new human being, right? And Hitler, was interested in manufacturing physically new human beings. People like Gleb Boki, they were interested in manufacturing culturally and spiritually the new human being, to program people's brains, to change people's brains. Okay, and the reason why Gleb Boki, this secret police commissar, became interested in this, he was one of the spearheads of the communist revolution in the Soviet Russia. And when Bolsheviks took over power, his expectation was that, everything would be fine. It would be new people, so the new world. And when it didn't happen, so what can you do? It's a tragedy. So, and he was executed eventually by Stalin, because Stalin hated these experiments, something suspicious. He tried to, like a gardener, to level the garden. When he was interrogated and tortured by Stalin's henchmen, Boki said that in 1921 I became frustrated about the whole project of Bolshevism, but I didn't want to betray the cause. And I became interested in mysticism. So I started looking for something that could answer our questions, only going to this spiritual side. Maybe we can locate some knowledge. So out of desperation, he started to sponsor this research, invested. It's another interesting chapter in my book. He found that, of course, when there are people with money, there always somebody comes, to serve the needs. So this guy named Gleb Boki eventually found an occult writer from St. Petersburg, certain Alexander Barchenko, and sponsored him. So this writer Barchenko organized expeditions to Siberia, to Mongolia. They wanted to go to Tibet, but could not do it because the Soviet government already was running a few expeditions, going to Dalai Lama, trying to sway him to Red Russia's side. But to make a long story short, this Gleb Boki, cryptographer, invested $100,000 into quest for Shambhala. Can you imagine? At that time when Russia was suffering from cold and hunger. Yeah, 1920s. Read this chapter again.
Well, there's another story of investing millions of dollars in the quest for Shambhala later in the 1970s in the recreation of the bastardization of that concept and name, namely Shangri-La, in the musical version of Lost Horizon from 1973, which we're screening this Friday. So if you want a very different take on the Shambhala myth, you should come to that, featuring some of the greatest actors ever assembled on screen, but none of whom could sing. And this was a musical by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. So you had John Gielgud, Liv Ullmann, Sally Kellerman, George Kennedy, Charles Boyer, Michael York, Olivia Hussey, the list goes on. None of them could sing at all. Or,
That's
as
amazing.
you'll see, dance. But they do dance. They move. And so that's another take. But meanwhile, why don't we go upstairs? And if you'd like to explore more about Red Shambhala, these extraordinary stories, Dr. Znamenski would be happy to sign a book or two for you. Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.